Welcome, and finally we're here with the drafting video, talking about drafts in Hero League, talking about how you should be drafting, how you should approach a draft, and what you can learn to improve your draft. Before we begin with the whole shebang, just as a reminder and obviously as general advice, you will not learn drafting from one video. Like, you will not watch this video now and then be a master drafter and be super good at drafting. That's very unlikely, because drafting is something that you have to learn from many drafts played, from many drafts seen, and obviously also heavily depends on which elo you're playing, roles you like to play, and you, as always, can never force your teammate to do anything. So this should help you to just learn about drafting for yourself and also see things in draft that you want to improve on, but also, for example, knowing what you should be picking, see what's happening in the draft. Okay, let's jump into it. So, generally speaking, drafting in Heroes is very different from other games. You might have seen other MOBAs that have a draft mode. You might see other games that have draft modes that are not MOBAs. But generally speaking, Heroes is very, very versatile and has so many different things that you have to look into that you will need to probably play a couple of hundred drafts before you completely understand everything that you need to know about drafting. It's also dependent on many, many factors in Heroes of the Storm, because we have 13 battlegrounds, or even more when Hanamura comes back, and they already talked about new battlegrounds this year as well. So there's more variety in that than in other MOBAs, so you have to keep that in mind. And then also, it's not only that you have drafting in terms of map presence and stuff like that, but you also have to differentiate between 2-lane maps and 3-lane maps. That's something that obviously is not as common in other games, where you only have one map that you have to take care of, and that map is always the same. So we have different battlegrounds, but also the battlegrounds have differences in objectives, but also in the setup of lanes. Also, we obviously have more than 70 heroes now, so you have to be very, very careful to understand everything and make sure that you keep that in mind. If you haven't drafted ever in your life, then you should definitely just go through an unranked draft game, or even set up a custom game to see who's drafting what. We're not going to go through the ban A, ban B, and everything. You should know how to do that. When is your turn to pick and ban? And that's something that you have to know before you even think about jumping into Hero League. So you definitely need to play some unranked games to just see the whole draft procedure. Important to say is that, in general, the person with the highest MMR is banning over everybody else. So if you have the highest MMR, you have the crown. The only exception from that is that you are in your placement games. If there's people that are outside of the placements that already have placed in the season, then they will always ban over everybody who is in placements. That means, like, for example, if you are a master player and you haven't finished your placements yet, and somebody is Diamond 1, they will still ban over you, even though you will have higher MMR. In the background, you will see also some draft videos that I took throughout the last season, so don't worry about what I'm showing. It's more like a background noise. We're going to look into different other images to give you a little bit more input of what's going on. So the very basic of every draft that you should look into for Hero League. It's really, really important that you understand what the hero roles are. So in Heroes of the Storm, we have 4 hero roles. We actually have 5 if you take in consideration that Varian is a multi-class hero. But the 4 roles are normally what you have to see. On the left, it's the warrior. Then next to it, we have assassin with the red sword, and then we have support and specialists. Again, Varian is a multi-class hero, but he can only be assassin or warrior. He doesn't have any other specialty. You should always know which roles these are. It's also important that you differentiate between tank and warrior. A warrior is a hero that can be a tank and a bruiser, but a tank, and generally speaking, can't be a bruiser. That means that while there are some heroes that can do both, most of the time you want to have the differentiation set so that you know which heroes are what. Also, the same goes for support. Supports are not always healers, and healers are not always supports. that was a little bit weird formulation. Obviously, there are supports, but they're not considered to be supports in the sense of like they can't heal, or they do something supporty that is not healing. So for example, for the warrior situation, Meridian is considered a tank, and then Sonya would be a bruiser. So you need to know which heroes have these different connotations to them, so that you know what to pick and which situation. Generally speaking, for every draft that you are going to play in Hero League, you want to have a warrior that is a tank and a support that is a healer. You always want a healer and a tank in your group. You can win drafts or in games without those roles, but generally speaking, everybody in the Heroes competitive scene, everybody in esports scene, and everybody in even low rank Hero League will tell you that you need a healer and a tank, and you should always have that. And then you have 3 others that fulfill the draft, because you have 5 people per team, right? So that's something that you just have to keep in mind, that you always know which heroes fulfill which role and even which sub role they fulfill. What else do you need to know in draft? It's not only about you knowing which roles to play, but also what are the things that you need to do on the battleground. As I said, there are 13 battlegrounds or even more in the future. There's 2 and 3 lane maps. So it's very important that you know what you need from a draft. You don't only need a healer and a tank, but you also need other things. For example, wave clear is something that you need in every draft. If you have 5 heroes that have all no wave clear, you will most likely lose the game because you can't push out the lanes when the enemy pushes you in. This is also important for rotations, for example. If you play Tomb of the Spider Queen, it's very common to have 1 solo laner and then 4 people rotating. If neither the solo laner nor the 4-man rotation can clear waves, they're going to be having a lot of difficulties to actually win any fights, because they will always be fighting in enemy minions, or they have to be running around to clear enemy minions. That oftentimes also leads to a situation where you split up. So wave clear is probably the most important thing that you should keep in mind. So if you're in a draft and your teammates have drafted 4 other heroes, and they drafted a tank and the healer, and there's no wave clear, you should always look into wave clear instead of, for example, saying like, oh, I'm going to pick an assassin that can just kill somebody. You should always have that in mind, like, what else do our draft need? The second thing that I would want to point out is objective power. Objective power can be something that is confusing if you don't know all the battlegrounds. So make sure that you know the battlegrounds and that you understand what the objective on the battleground is. So for example, objective power can be wave clear. If you're playing Infernal Shrines, you have the little skeletons that spawn on the shrines that you have to kill for the Punisher to spawn. So if you have good heroes like Greyman and Vala that have great clearing and can help you kill those little monsters very quickly, they are good on this map. On the other sense, also like Battlefield of Eternity doesn't have any wave clearing that is needed for the objective. It's just a monster in the middle of the map. But again, Vala and Greyman would be very, very good for that. So you need to understand what is the objective and which heroes are good for the objective. This can depend on any map. That can also be different heroes for different maps, or it can be the same heroes. As I said, Battlefield of Eternity as well as Infernal Shrines, I would both maps draft Vala and Greyman. Another important thing is that you look into draft as what can you do on the map itself. On Cursed Hollow, for example, while the curse is very important, most of the time it's really important that you also secure the bosses and the mercenaries. There's a Cursed Hollow guide on my video playlist as well. If you haven't seen that, take a look for that. But Zarya and Tyrael, for example, are very good for zone controlling. They can take away bosses, they can take away objective points. This can be very, very helpful, even on maps that have control points to take over. For example, on Braxis or in Dragonshire, they can push off other heroes that then can't, stop you from taking the point, or they themselves can't be on the point, and then you can steal it away from them if it's a boss, or you can get a couple of percentages on Braxis holdout, for example. So keep in mind if you need those heroes in the draft. If you look at the map and it's Braxis, think about, do we have somebody who can clear the minions? Do we have somebody who can clear the Zerg wave if we lose it? Do we have somebody who can push away people from the points? And again, you can't obviously influence what your teammates are picking, but if you are picking for yourself, don't always pick something selfish because you want to play it, but also have these objectives in mind. Other than that, obviously, there's global pressure that we talked about in the Cursed Hollow video, as I said. You will have situations where you will need a solo laner that can farm for a long time on a lane and then continues to soak XP, but can jump in very quickly. That could be Falsa, that could be Dehaka, a hero that basically can take advantage of the huge map and create pressure like that. You don't always need a global, so not on every big map you need a global hero. That's not given, but it can give you an advantage. And then last but not least, I want to also mention that there's cheese. So there's cheesy compositions, cheesy heroes that you can play. There's things that you can play with, for example, Sylvanas. They can cheese towers, or even play things like Lieutenant Morales with Medivac, where you can literally just like fly into the enemy keep, destroy it, and then go for the core or something like that. So cheese is always something that you can keep in mind, but it's more so that you are aware of the cheese that the enemy team can be playing. If they're banning out Leoric and Tychus, and they have the last two picks, you might want to consider banning Cho'Gall early on, because they might be picking it, or that you draft around it, that you know that, hey, there's cheese coming, I'm going to do something about it. Now we're going to go over to something that is, in my opinion, very important, but not a lot of people think about it or try to understand about drafting. There's easy drafts, there's medium difficulty drafts, and there's difficult and hard drafts. With that, I mean they're easy, medium, difficult, or hard to pull off. So if you draft 5 heroes, for example, in a Hero League that is don't have a tank or a healer, in most games you will lose those games. That would be a very difficult or very hard draft, because you have nobody who can sustain you. The enemy team has a healer, and they also have a tank. So if you, for example, played with like 5 assassins against a fully drafted team, that's going to be very difficult for you. The, in my opinion, best composition in a draft is probably kind of something like this. So you have Cassia, Stukov, Johanna, Jaina, and Sonya. I'm going to explain what all of them are doing. The important thing is that you have one tank and Johanna, you have one healer and Stukov, you have a bruiser, Sonya, you have a mage and Jaina, and you have an auto attacker with Cassia. And don't be too focused on auto attacker. Like, obviously Cassia also has spells, she doesn't heavily rely on her auto attacks, but it's a different situation where her auto attacks actually hurt, while Jaina's auto attacks actually do not do that much damage without talents. So that's a differentiation between those two. Why is this an easy composition, or a composition that I would always recommend building? First, everybody knows what their role is. In this composition, Sonya should know, okay, I'm the solo laner. I'm also the bruiser, so I'm helping the main tank to initiate or put pressure on the enemy backline. Johanna knows she's the main tank. She also knows that she has wave clear that she can help with, and she's, the person that should be taking care of their front line, not initiating into our backline, or she should also disrupt their backline depending on how they can flank. Stukov's the healer. There's not much more to say. Like, he's obviously also versatile on doing other things, but mainly he should be healing everybody. And then the two damage dealers are both range, but they have different power levels on mana and auto attacks. So they should definitely know what they're doing, which is killing something. But they also have different setups. So Jaina has very long cooldowns and is mana heavy, while Cassia has shorter cooldowns and can auto attack. So they shouldn't be stacking up each other. Their cooldowns shouldn't be too long so that both of them can't do anything. They should actually be helping each other. Jaina bursts somebody, Cassia can finish them, for example. So these have 5 heroes. They're all different, and they have a very easy to understand role. It also can't be countered. There's no draft that can immediately counter all 5 of these heroes. If you have blinds, cool, you can counter maybe Cassia and Sonya, but Jaina can still do magic damage. You have something that reduces spell power, awesome. Sonya and Jaina maybe do less damage, but Cassia can still go auto attack build that does more damage, even though you debuffed her. So this is something that you just keep in mind. This is, in my opinion, probably the easiest draft to pull off. We have an auto attack damage dealer, you have a mage damage dealer, you have a solo laner that is a bruiser, you have a main tank, and you have a healer. Why is this important? When you see what your team is drafting, you should understand which role you should be picking into. If they have none of these above, you should be also aware that you're going to be in trouble if everybody's picking 5 assassins. So you can say something in chat, for example. The other thing is also that you have to understand that some other drafts are going to be more difficult to pull off. As an example, if you have one tank and one healer, which is, perfect, but then you have 3 range DDs that are all mages, or 2 of them are mages. It's going to be very difficult times to understand who does what. First of all, mages normally don't solo lane that well. So who does the solo laning? Mages sometimes also don't do mercenaries that well. Who does those? Wave clear is normally very easy with mages, but if you're rotating with them, who is the 4-man rotation? Who's the person that is off the rotation? Who goes first? It's normally the tank, but if you are in a situation where the tank is split, who goes first into a bush? Nobody of those 2 or 3 mages want to go into a bush. So it's very difficult to understand who does what, which mage is doing some of the other duties that are missing. And then also, you are super mana dependent. So once the cooldowns are out and the mana is out, your damage dealers don't do any damage. The auto attacks do nothing, basically, or next to nothing. So you also don't have any wave clear. And you don't have any meat shields beside your tank. So if they kill your tank, you normally are not going to have a good time, especially if you have blown all of your cooldowns. So you have to understand that this is a more difficult draft. It's not impossible to play it, but it's more difficult. So in my opinion, you should always try to avoid having more than 1 mage. I personally don't like to play 2 mages. I think 3 mages is probably suicide. Something that is a little bit easier to pull off than the example with the 3 mages is something like 1 tank, 1 healer, a support, so not a healer, like let's say Tassadar, 1 auto attacker and 1 bruiser. So the roles in this situation are very clear. You have a tank, you have a healer, you have a support that is, supporting the healer, and then you have an auto attacker and a bruiser. An example would be Tracer Tassadar composition with a Sonya, a tank, and a healer. It's pretty clear defined that the hard carry Tracer in this case should be doing the most damage, and that she should be doing the rotation with the support with Tassadar, because they work very well together. But you also have the issue that if you don't run a 4-man rotation, the healer can't solo Soko lane. If you have a tank that doesn't have very good wave clear, you have the issue that they also don't do anything together, because they just stand there and lane and do like trickle damage against minions. And then you have the bruiser that does the normal job. So while it's clear roles, it can be very difficult to find out who does what, and it could be easily countered if they can take out your carry. So if, for example, they can blind it, or if they can, what we also have seen Gul'dan compositions with double support. If you can reduce their damage, there's nothing that you can do with that combo. So that just, again, as an example, which would be a more difficult draft than the tank, healer, bruiser, AA, and mage. And then we're gonna go to like ridiculous examples, but it's important that you understand those things because you have the decision to draft something else. So if you draft some of these heroes in this picture after one of them has already been drafted, so for example, there is a Medivh already, and you want to draft a Tyrande or a Murky into this, you're gonna have to have a hard time, because all 3 of these heroes don't do something specific very, very good. Sure, Murky might have okay wave clear, but he doesn't do team fighting very well, and he needs some time to come online. So Tyrande needs to heal him as the main healer, but she can't because her heal's not very strong. But Medivh now actually supports Tyrande because, he gives shield, so her heal should be fine, right? Yes and no. It's very difficult to pull off these specific combos where it's like no real healer, no real support, no real specialist that does damage. Because you run into situations where it's just chaotic, everybody splits up, and the synergies that you build beforehand with, hey, Medivh just shields somebody and then they get healed by Tyrande, might not happen. It's also important that specialists, generally speaking, are not assassins. Some of them do quite a bit of damage, like Nazeebo, for example, or Zagara, but if you stack them up, their damage definitely is lesser than that of 2 assassins in general. That might change depending on which specialists are added, etc., but generally speaking, you don't want to use, similar to 2 mages, you don't want to use 2 specialists too often. It can work, but I would stay away from it. Other than that, you should also stay away from things like full melee compositions. That can just look really bad because you get countered by one ability, which is blind. So if all of your heroes do more auto attack damage or are focused on auto attack damage, the enemy drafts 2 people with blind, and then suddenly your draft doesn't do anything anymore. These are the things that you should recognize. Like if your teammates have drafted 2 melees already, and you also want to draft that other melee that you're really good with, maybe pick something on range node that you are also okay with. Obviously, that means that you have to be more flexible, which brings us to the next point. First picking and pick priority is very important. So you have to understand what goes where. Generally speaking, if you look at the video, the top left and top right are the bans. So banning is happening on the first rotation and the second rotation. So basically, before the draft starts, you ban a hero. In general speaking, you should always ban something that's considered overpowered or broken or that is not easily countered. So at the moment, as an example, we have Maiev and Thrall who are considered very, very strong. You will see this because everybody who's drafting is currently banning them. So they're easy to see. You will find out who are those heroes. But it also doesn't mean that you need to ban these heroes. If you, in particular, like struggle against certain heroes, you can totally ban them. Obviously, there's going to be people that's going to say like, oh, you should have banned this or whatever. But if you, for example, always lose against an Asmodan on the specific map, don't feel shamed or worried about banning him. Just remove him. It's one ban. It's one hero out of 70. So maybe they wanted to pick it, maybe they didn't want to pick it. But it's important that your first pick definitely has an impact. But because you don't know what the team is drafting, you need to be decisive. Either ban something that is OP or ban something that you feel is going to make your day worse. On the first couple of picks, you also want to be showing something that either is very strong or that you feel very strong in. You should also avoid picking heroes that are easily countered. So for example, if you want to pick your first pick, you definitely want to pick your best hero. But if your best hero is easily countered by 2 other heroes, you probably don't want to pick him first. Let's take an example. If you're a huge Tracer player and you're really good with Tracer, and you pick her first, the enemy team can pick away Tassadar, Emma Furion, for example, in their first rotation. Or they can pick 2 heroes that can easily counter Tracer. Or they can pick very meaty heroes that can therefore counter Tracer. So she is an example that normally doesn't want to get picked first in the Hero League setting. I know in competitive play and in very high Grandmaster play, there's going to be Tracer bans as well because she's very, very strong. But generally speaking, she's one of those heroes that can be countered. Another example would be Uther. If you pick Uther first, the enemy might be picking a lot of dots or damage that is more over time, which is something that Uther struggles with quite a bit. So try to be flexible in the first couple of picks and pick something that is more general list heroes. Things like Myrddin, ETC, Rhaegar, Sonya, Thrall. Things that can't be countered, but also don't get smushed by other heroes and are pretty weak. You can also pick comfortable things. Like if you are first pick and you can't come up with anything that is, not easily counterable, you can do something like picking a hero that is, is countered by the enemy. If you're super good at it, maybe you can carry it. But generally speaking, I would personally pick something that is not, countered by 2 other picks, because if you're first pick and the other team just gets 2 picks afterwards and they deny your hero, tough luck. It's going to be very difficult. On the other hand, don't pick OP heroes just because they're OP. If you have heard that Genji is completely broken and that he's super, super imba, but he's level 5 and you haven't played him in a year, don't pick him first. Rather pick something that you're comfortable with than OP heroes that you can't play. I personally would have a solid Myrddin over, a shitty Genji every day of my drafts. When we go down further in the list of picks, the second and third rotations normally can pick whatever they want, but then we come to the last pick, and I'm talking about this specifically because it's very difficult sometimes to fill all of the roles. If you're last picks, it's very good to let the team know what you're good at and what you're not so good at. Again, obviously people sometimes don't like to play warrior or support, they don't want to play healer, and there's some negativity around that, like, oh, you should do this and you should be able to do it. Sure, totally fine, but realistically you will have roles that you're not as good as. as in other roles. If you only want to play Ranch Assassin, I have bad news for you. If you're last pick, you probably won't get it. But if you say like, hey, my tank is better than my support, it allows the other people that are picking in front of you to pick something up that is still missing from the rotation. Just keep that in mind. And in the end, the last position will always have to fill, and you should always do that. So if your team picked a tank and 3 assassins, you will, or you should at least, pick a healer. There's nothing worse, in my opinion, than triggering a full team because you didn't want to heal, and you're actually not really good at healing, so other people should have picked something else. Brooding and being negative about, you know, what you wanted to pick and what didn't happen doesn't help anybody. Just pick a healer and try to play your best. This way, your team at least has the chance to win a game without going into the game negatively after having a bad draft. One last thing before we end this, and it's again a very basic video. We'll have to look at a lot of other strategy guides for drafting and becoming a good drafter. You have to understand win conditions in draft. And win conditions is something that is a buzzword for the Heroes community. Basically, you have to understand what happens with the heroes that the enemy team has. So for example, Uther and Genji are a composition that is played together because Uther can give Genji the Divine Shield, which he can then use to activate Dragon Blade and basically wreak havoc in the enemy team. But if you pick a lot of dots against Uther, or some dots against Uther, you might be able to poke their enemy team down already, and he can't heal them up. So even if Genji gets a kill with the Dragon Blade, everybody else on the enemy team might be low, and the Uther might not be able to pick that up by healing everybody. That means that the win condition for them would be getting good Dragon Blade Divine Shield compositions off, or combinations of, and your counterplay for that win condition is that you already poke them down low so that Uther can't really concentrate on helping Genji with everything, and you might get kills either as a counter or even before the Dragon Blade can do, you know, a lot of damage. Another thing that I already mentioned, if the enemy picks a lot of auto-attack heroes and auto-attack melees, counter with blinds, pick a couple of blinds up so that you can see, hey, our win condition would be we go into team fights and then we blind them and they can't do damage to us. But it could also be that you say, hey, the enemy team doesn't have a lot of wave clear for the Infernal Shrines, so on the altar, we don't want to team fight them, we just want to poke and try to get some skulls or some, whatever they're called, minions from the shrine to get closer to the Punisher. But if they're going to attack into us, we split up and soak the lanes because it will take them a long time to get all 40 skulls. So in this time we can soak experience. And if the enemy then goes in and says like, okay, we need to counter that by also soaking experience, you can go back in and clear very quickly the minions that you need for the Punisher. So understanding that the enemy doesn't have a lot of wave clear and countering it with, you know, either drafting more wave clear or being more aware of your situation of being able to clear the shrine better is something that you have to recognize in draft, which will help you to play the game a lot easier. If you don't know what's going on in the game and you just react on things happening, you'll oftentimes be in situations where you end up, you know, losing a fight and you're like, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done something differently. And that's really important. And then lastly, obviously do something on the win condition that can, you know, heavily dictate the game. For example, they don't pick a good solo laner. Like they pick something that isn't good at solo laning. Let's say they put Chromie in the solo lane. And you have a great solo laner. You just punish that. You just like push the wave in, you gank their solo laner, you, you know, stay longer in the lane because you have a Dehaka, and then you get an advantage out of the XP. Again, you can't, you know, influence what your team is drafting or what the other people are drafting. But if you see something that is so obvious where you're like, hey, they drafted 5 heroes and none of them is good in the solo lane, I'm going to, you know, last pick something that is really good in the solo lane and I'm going to punish them. Understanding that win condition of yours, like we can get ahead, we can get, you know, objectives and everything without them being able to do anything against it is really, really important. But it comes with time. So again, you will need to play a lot of drafts before you can completely understand what helps where and what does what. Overall, again, I'm just going to pick up my favorite composition one more time to give you the dream combo which you should always strive for. If your team picks 2 mages, don't pick another mage into it. If your team already has a tank and a bruiser, maybe don't pick another melee into it. If your team already has a healer and is lacking damage, don't pick another healer, pick something else. Again, you will always only fill out drafts with your picks, but you can communicate with your teammates saying like, hey, I think we're lacking wave here. Hey, I think we're missing a tank here. Hey, I think Dehaka shouldn't be solo tank. You can't force them to pick something that you don't want them to pick, but you can always fill your role. You can always do your part. You can always recognize how strong is my draft of my team? What can I do to improve it? And learning that will be a vital lesson and a great tool for you to get better in Hero League. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions for me, put it in the YouTube comments. And yeah, as always, I see you next time. Have a good one. Bye bye.